we're gonna talk about now just the Western allies and kind of what happened in these specific countries. I'm gonna really focus on just a few things. They should be a little bit quicker, but I want to go over it. Political cartoon once again showing two sides uh, with a stockpile of nuclear weapons, knowing that they can't use them because if they do, the enemy might retaliate and destroy them. And so they fight in different ways, but they're not able to use the stockpile of nukes. And because it's, once again, both say on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. That's that idea of that nuclear deterrent that we talked about. Like having a stockpile of nukes means it's not necessarily to use them, but it's to prove to the enemy like, hey, if you even think about using them on us, we'll just use ours on you and we'll destroy each other. So if that's what you want to do, let's do it. And so it's obviously very tense because the United States and Soviet Union could have destroyed the world several times over if they chose to. Luckily, they didn't because they had so many nukes. Uh, Great Britain after the war. I'm going to kind of just gloss through these because there's a couple of key things I want to talk about. But like I said this in class, that they probably suffered the most in terms of status because for a long time we talked about how Britain was so powerful. They were the most powerful country. You know, they were the first to industrialize. They had the strongest navy for a long time, and they were the country to be for a long time. And that image suffered a little bit after World War One. But definitely after World War II, they took a step back. They're going to start losing their colonies. They're going to relinquish their colonies, meaning give them up. A lot of their colonies in Asia, Africa, these colonies are going to start to become independent. India is going to become independent. That was a main colony that they had. And so all these colonies are going to become independent. They're not going to be able to rely on them as much. And so Britain's going to suffer great loss to their empire, their world status, and they're going to kind of take a backseat to the United States. West Germany, they were a pretty remarkable story, especially compared to Eastern Europe and East Germany, where and so sorry about that. West Germany, they through getting money through the Marshall Plan. Once again, that's that economic recovery plan. They were able to turn their cities are destroyed. They don't really have a completely changing governments. This is a pretty miraculous thing to change and adapt and become a pretty thriving economy in a very short period of time. It's quite the achievement. France is going to eventually become nuclear. They're going to um, have some problems. They're going to have some good things. We're just going to kind of skip through that because I'm not going to ask you anything about them. But the United States, once again, they have a period of economic growth. After World War II, they're the only country that is really intact. They just besides like Pearl Harbor, which was obviously rebuilt. They rebuilt their navy really quickly. But they started becoming more efficient. They with the Marshall Plan, they're able to give 13 to 17 billion dollars to Europe to rebuild. That's an investment that they're making. That's a lot of money that they're giving to these people, or they're loaning it. But part of the reason why they did that is to open up, to secure markets over there so they could sell their goods to European countries. And so, but they're going to become more efficient producing. They're going to, with automation, they're going to become, the leading producing nation. And this is really going to be a big thing that's going to help them in the Cold War. It's because the Soviet Union, they just can't. Their economy is built to supply the needs of the people. The United States, in a market economy, there's all sorts of goods and that can be produced that people don't necessarily need, but people want. And so you get a lot of choice. You got a lot of consumer choice, a lot of competition. And so that's going to help the U.S. economy thrive. But there were some things that I wanted to talk about specifically. One of them being the Red Scare. All right, I'm going to highlight this. The Red Scare was a dramatic fear. Whenever you hear the word red, it's referring to communism. And I've talked about this before, like the Red Army was the communist army. Red is often associated with communism. But this was a time in which dramatic fear of communism and communist spies spread across the nation. People feared communism was spreading into the government. Probably the most well-named in that was Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. And you might be like, well, you know, if what's the big deal with being a communist? Because it talks about here, it says many prominent writers were jailed, politicians were jailed, people were uh, in some cases killed for being communist spies. They were executed for being convicted as being communist spies. And so you're like, man, really? Is that big of a deal? If you think about it today, what are we at war with back then? We're at war with communist. We're battling the ideology, and so being called a communist, somebody we're at war with, is a big deal. People's careers would be ruined by the accusation of being a communist. You'd be thrown in jail at the accusation of being a communist. It was really kind of an unjust time. But if you equate it to today, what are we at war with? Well, we're at war with terror, and so it would be kind of the equivalent today of being called a terrorist. If somebody, if you're like, oh, my neighbor's a communist today, you might be like, that's not that big of a deal. But if somebody's like, oh, my neighbor's a terrorist, you'd be like, whoa, what the crap? Somebody arrest that guy. I don't want that guy in, I don't want that guy living next to me, because we're at war with terror, and terrorists are obviously that's not something you want to be accused of. And so whatever we're at war with, that's kind of the scary thing. And so back then we're at war with the communists. So it was a really bad thing to be called communist. Now, like I said, we're at war with terrorism. It'd be bad to be called a terrorist. And so being called a communist, just try to keep that in mind when we talk about that. Like, being called a communist was a big deal back then, and people took it very seriously. And this guy, we'll watch a video in class about him. But he would level accusations. He would call the government, and as the government was being run by communists, or they were being influenced by communists. He called Truman and Marshall communists. It's like, dude, come on, man. Like, Truman signed a document saying, I want to fight the spread of communism, basically. And Marshall's like, we don't want, we got to give money so these people don't become communists. And McCarthy's like, they're communists. It's like, what? Doesn't even make sense. But anyway, he used this to, he claimed that the army was infiltrated by communists. He used this to really gain a lot of popularity, made these wild accusations, really without any truth behind them. But it got people scared, because when you got a senator it'd be like a senator calling our president a terrorist. Like, somebody within our government being like, yeah, our president's a terrorist. Like, what? Like, you can't just say that. That's crazy, unless you have some backing, or our military is infiltrated by terrorists. It's like, what? That's crazy. But that's what it did. It created a lot of fear. And so McCarthy, when he talked about this, when he started accusing people of being communist, once again through the Red Scare, McCarthy really created a lot of fear in the American population. People began to fear and question, is communism threatening our country? Is there infiltration? Are there spies? And that's really what this whole time frame of McCarthyism, leveling accusations without evidence, the Red Scare, this was going on during the United States during the Cold War. This is so funny. And then we'll watch a video on that too. But that's what they would promote to people. If nuclear war happened, they're like, don't worry, you'll be fine. Just duck and cover. It's like, what? They would actually practice these drills. That's not a joke. That's a very real thing. They'd be like, all right, kids, a nuclear bomb's gonna hit, but don't worry, your desk will protect you. I guess if you feel safe, that's what matters. But yeah, that would not keep them safe. And the last thing I want to talk about, really hit on, is the Vietnam War. Vietnam is very similar to Korea in a sense that the North was communist and the South was, I don't want to say democratic, but they were anti-communist. And so that's how Vietnam was split. So once again, it was a former French colony. It was divided into two areas because Japan had obviously taken over that during the war. The French actually tried to get it back after the war. There was a lot of fighting between them, and they ended up not getting it back, obviously. But Ho Chi Minh, he was the communist that was backed by the Soviet Union, and Dien Diem was the, I wasn't democratic. I shouldn't say it was democratic. It was more anti-communist, pro-West, backed by the U.S. in the South. And so just like Just like Korea, the North is going to invade the South, and just like Korea, we are going to go and help. And so a big reason why we get involved in the Vietnam War is because of this right here. And I want you, once again, this is something I'll ask you about as well. It's the domino theory. The domino theory, the U.S. believed that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, then the rest of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. You line dominoes up in a row. If one falls over, you can kind of see in this picture, like, oh, China's falling. Korea is, if we let Korea fall to communists, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. It's again, if I scroll up to the map of Indochina, you can kind of see all these. There's Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and so the fear was is that if one fell, they would all fall. And so the United States, like, we got to stop it right here. And that's called the domino theory, that communism would go to all these countries once one fell. And so we got involved in Vietnam, and we stayed there for a very long time. Now, here's where it's unlike Korea. It didn't end well. We weren't able to fight off, in Korea, we were able to fight off the communists, end it in a ceasefire, and keep the South from becoming communist. Well, here is not the case. Uh, America got in, and some say 54, really 61. I mean, there's a lot of different like timelines when this really kind of happened, but uh, we were sending troops there for a very long time, and we just weren't really making any ground. And part of the problem was is the jungle style warfare. You can see like they're hiding. If you can imagine that guy in camouflage, there's a little like cubbyhole. You imagine that on his head. He's all dressed in clothing that would camouflage him. American soldiers are walking through the dark, and this guy's just sitting here. The jungle's booby trapped. You got these people just kind of all over in the tree line, hiding. It's not like a traditional warfare where we're like, oh, we got to go take this area. It's like they're wandering around Vietnam like it's their homeland. You know, they know where everything's at. We're just kind of there, and trying to help. And so that was one of the problems that we couldn't, we didn't know the land. These people are hiding. The jungle's all booby trapped, and it was very difficult to determine who was South Vietnamese, who was North Vietnamese. It was difficult to determine, and really it almost seemed like we cared more than the South Vietnamese did. And so uh, we're trying to fight a war to where it's nobody's really that passionate about except us. And it's like, we're spending all this money trying to stop Vietnam from becoming communist. But the Vietnamese, and Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Cong, are like, hey, this is our country. We're going to fight to the death to make sure it becomes communist. Whereas America, it's like, well, whatever, we're doing our thing. So, but the war was very costly. There was a lot of discontent growing in America. Thousands of people were boycotting. There's a picture of this actually happened at Kent State. A couple students were killed in a protest of the Vietnam War. But the Vietnam War was heavily debated. Obviously, people thought we were fighting a war we shouldn't be in. It was going on for a long time. Tens of thousands of our soldiers are dying to prevent a country from becoming communist that doesn't really care, it seems like. Billions of dollars are being spent. And so eventually in 1973, we finally get out of Vietnam and we bring them back home, bring soldiers back home, and South Vietnam is going to be taken over by communists, and the dominoes really aren't going to fall. It's not like all of Asia fell into communist, uh, but that like what we feared. Um, but it was definitely a black eye on America because every war we had got in, like, oh yeah, World War II, we dominate, or we had really good success. Of Korean War, yeah, hey, we'll help you. We enter and we help push the North Koreans back. And so when Vietnam's happening, we're like, little Vietnam, we'll take this over, no problem. And then we get involved in Vietnam, and it's like, oh man, it was kind of embarrassing. We definitely didn't win this war, and so Vietnam was definitely a black eye on America, and kind of proved that maybe we shouldn't stick our nose in a lot of things. And so we were a little bit more reserved to get involved in these kind of things again, these kind of wars. But you'll learn more about this more next year, but it is worth talking about.